Hi everyone, this is Laura Poirot. I'm going to do a 5-part series exposing the fact that the United States of America is under the British Empire and is a British colony under a Republican rule, and how Donald Trump, since 2017, has led for America Agenda 2030, but also with the help of the Uni Party, meaning Obama and also Biden as a Uni Party, because they are all under colonial rule. And what I will explain is that there is a difference between the legislative system in the US, which is just a British offshoot of government, which is in Washington, and there is that's a separation from the executive administration of the legislature, which is purely just a president or a mere agent passing policy and basically witnessing the changes of legislation or the adoption of legislation, which is British, and so forth. And so you can understand that through their administration, which Trump's administration is British, is under Heritage Foundation, which is a Tavistock MI6 operation that was founded by MI6 Fabian's socialist and I think Tavistock agent Peter Vickers Hall. Through that administration since 2017, and no doubt prior with the other presidents, Trump committed to and adopted their policies to lead the AI and open banking policies for America, to digitalize the economy and to get us into, to get America, to lead America into Agenda 2030. Now, that all being said, I'm going to start off by saying you will have the YouTube Megxit community naming and shaming me. If they don't, they will just say I'm paranoid, or someone down in the comments will say I'm paranoid. It's either I'm paranoid or that I'm a loony for being supposedly an egotistical bitch, for calling out controlled opposition, for calling out the community when they have acted as controlled opposition, which I will debunk with this 5-part series anyway, as just a consequence of my research. And the arms and the ahs in my videos, the fact that I'm more of a researcher than a presenter, they will say anything possible to steer you, to minimize my my following, for all of the community to not participate in this conversation, to not engage with me. I don't have anyone publicly engaging with me. I have probably one account privately engaging with me through DM, but would never publicly engage with me. That would be too much. And there is definite public steering and reward for that steering by these accounts, but it's to minimize my following and to ensure that by algorithm as well, that my content is suppressed and won't be looked at, because this is not about the truth. This is about steering you into believing Trump is a solution and savior that works against Agenda 2030, which is not true at all, and which is what I'm about to show you. So this first video is going to be about the timeline, specifically around the creation of the Federal Republic of America, the Federal British Republic of America, and how it turned into a democracy and why, still under British colonial rule, just that Britain needed to restructure because they have restructured many, many times. They didn't want to replicate the failings of the Roman Empire. They needed to restructure from an imperial feudal ruling system of the king really governing America and also their colonies, to a government of the people, which was not happening in UK at the time. UK government, really, the British people didn't give a shit, a rat's ass about the government, because they felt it was just the British aristocracy, which it still is today. But through the implementation of Fabian socialism, which is our basically political economic, how they rule us at this moment, through the creation of the Labour Party in 1900 in UK, with all of this democracy ruling in the colonies. They created people's governments where people felt like they had free will, and the rule of the king, who had the power of the public acts, meaning legislature of all colonies and Britain, was hidden from plain sight, and so he was no longer liable. Things can take place where you're believing you have free will. They needed to change the structure of the British Empire to be able to internationalize and to centralize governance at this point, to have one federation, to have one empire ruling the world. And this has been going on for a very, very long time. But I'll talk about this. I will send you links. This research is incomplete. It's not everything, but it will give you an idea, a rough sketch of what's taken place. Okay, so let's go back to 1783 in America. After, I'm guessing, the war with Britain, America, there's a treaty. I think there's a treaty signed. I don't know the ins and outs of this point in time, but Lincoln was also an asset, a British asset. In Carnegie's book, Triumphant Democracy, in 1893, he talks about Lincoln being a British asset that was assigned by Britain. So anyway, 1783, America becomes a republic under the King of Britain, under the British Empire. They are not fully self-governing. They are still directly under the king, so to speak. Hence why you have a civil war later on. The Constitution in 1787 and 1789 becomes effective in 1789, but is written up by 1787, is modelled from the British government. US Congress that writes out legislation is an offshoot. The House of Representatives that's created through this Constitution is an offshoot of Britain's House of Commons. So the laws are still subsequently passed from the king through to US Congress and the House of Representatives. The people do not pass laws. The US per se doesn't really pass any laws. They're not fully self-governing at the time of the Constitution. So when people talk about the Constitution, the US Constitution, governing full democracy, promoting full democracy, that is absolute crap. America didn't have a democracy at that point. It was a federal republic that was did not have the ability to fully self-govern. Hence, why there was a civil war about how the federal government, or the federal government of US states were meant to be governed. They wanted a separation of all of these Commonwealth states, which, at this point, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Virginia, Commonwealth of, I think, Massachusetts, they are still all Commonwealths. They were to remain separate, or they were to be unified. Britain wanted America to be unified, to have one American federation that ruled everything, to make it cleaner, to make it easier to control. And they also wanted to tax you for reparations of the war against them in the 1700s. So the Civil War comes out in 1861, April, and by August, the Revenue Act of 1861 comes out, where US establishes a federal income tax to help what have I written here? I'm just writing, to help pay Britain reparations. But what they've said is it's under the guise of paying for war efforts at the current war efforts at the time of civil war, which is a bit too early. You've just started war in April, and by August you've got this full law coming out to pretty much pay reparations to to Britain. Now, that was repealed by 1872, and the issue was obviously, I'm presuming that Americans obviously knew that they were paying to the king because they were still not fully self-governing. And also that it wasn't, the explanation nowadays is that it wasn't mandatory and optional, and people decided not to pay it. But I believe it was to do with the whole Civil War effort and the fact that it was just repealed because of the restructure of the British Empire. Anyway, it was repealed in 1872, and during 1861 and 1872, Britain realised the way to, unless it was prior and the Civil War was orchestrated by Britain, to create this treaty whereby US becomes a people's government and changes the whole imperial rule of the British Empire. At this point, what was I saying? I've just lost my train of thought. I apologize. The federal income tax is repealed, but during this time, the UK is realising that they can't just enforce income tax under the king, because the king therefore will be liable and the empire will be liable. And they wanted to restructure the governance of all colonies to be able to impose these taxes and to internationalize a global, to make the empire a global one. So this was already in the books around this time. And so 4 years after the tax has been imposed, before they repeal it, 1865, Lord Thring, who is a British lord, creates the Colonial Laws Act, which, and this the very same year, is the abolition of slavery in America. The Colonial Laws Act allows greater autonomy to the British colonies that weren't subject, to create, by allowing colonial legislatures to create laws that weren't subject to disallowance. It provided a way that they could pass laws, but there was a rule that they could not and must not contradict British imperial laws either. So there were still British imperial laws in place by 1865, and the Constitution was not sufficient, was not enough for for America to be a full people's government. So the beginning of that was in 1865 with the Colonial Laws Act by Lord Thring, which allowed them to pass laws and act for themselves in a way under the colonies. So it was like trusting them to do the right thing, but there were rules. They must not contradict the British Empire and their laws through their House of Commons. So the House of Commons and the US Congress, or the House of Representatives, had to work together, or pretty much just be the offshoot, which it already was, of UK government. So that was the beginning of creating the free will of not just America, but the colonies, including Australia, etc., etc. Australia did replicate, through Britain. Our constitution was replicated from the US Constitution, but it wasn't like, it was progressive in a way that it gave the colonies a feel of independence, of being a republic, say, like America was, but it wasn't full governance until these laws were passed. So we've got the abolition of slavery and this Laws Act in 1865. They repeal the tax because of that Colonial Laws Act and the way they're going to restructure. They've decided to restructure. By 1872, they repeal the tax, the income tax, and they're going to create a democracy in order to make you feel like, for 30 years later, when they put in the mandatory income tax, that it's under the free will of the people. So 1870, so 2 years before the tax is repealed, the 15th Amendment comes in into the Constitution. And by 1881, there is 1881, I think we're looking at this point, a British German by the name of Henry Heinemann creates the federal socialist democracy, pretty much creates socialism in the UK, and uses it as the economic solution to this, what will be the democracy of the colonies. Now, by 1881, Heinemann talks about the forecasting that capitalism, which will be used initially for the short term, is just a means of socialism, of creating a proletariat, which is a working class, forcing you to work by means to exist and to survive, and paying taxes, those mandatory income taxes to Britain. It was a way to create the proletariat under free will. But there was also the other side of socialism, which was communism. And his mentor, Marxism, before that it was, or Karl Marx, before that it was Owenism. That was the origins of communism, socialism, whatever have you. Karl Marx there was no difference between communism and socialism, because it was just to create a proletariat, a working class system. And the difference in Heinemann's mind between socialism and communism is that the people's labor becomes mandatory and allocated, whereas socialism is more of the free will of the people to be able to choose what they decide to work for and work at, and or decide to work at all, which isn't necessarily true. It's just a way of manipulating you to believe that you have free will, right? So communism and democracy are both socialism, are both a socialism construct, just the two extremes, one on one side, one on the other, and in the middle there's socialism. And he creates the federal socialist democracy. And he knows by 1881 that capitalism will die out as socialism will take its place. In order for socialism to for colonial governance of the British Empire, mind you, for that to take place, there needs to be what socialism is and what later becomes 3 years later from his foundations, the Fabianism, or the Fabian Society, which Tony Blair, leads at this point. But almost all politicians, all prime ministers and presidents are Fabianists, because that is the end goal of this governance of Agenda 2030, alongside everything else. What that society or that plan entails is not just an international governance of the world and an international banknote. It is also, to get to that point, for capitalism to collapse and for socialism to take its place, is the gradual equalization of all colonies. And they realized at that point in 1881 that Japan, Imperial Japan, was not the same as tribal Australia. And they needed cultural hegemony. They needed a equalization culturally, ethically. That's why you have interfaith at the moment, that Prince Charles at the time in the early 1990s, and his father, who is the founder of almost everything involved in this whole globalization of the empire. They push interfaith in the early 1990s. That's why you have that happening all over. And they're also using immigration for that as well, to blend a borderless society, to create equalization of all colonies, of all nations under the British Empire. They need that to create, for socialism to prevail. So they've needed decades and decades of planning and strategy and implementation. And under Hyman, under this plan, then under Fabian Society, the plan is America, that Europe, for the globalization of the world, America and Europe will unite, and it will either be Germany or America. This is before, I think this is 1916 and 1909. So these sorts of plans, these sorts of discussions. And so this was like, during World War One. So you can tell the reasons for World War One. That Germany and America would be, one of them will be the ones to unite Europe and America, which would mean America would need to become a democracy and to be the powerhouse economically and politically of the colonial democracy, which they then, developed and initiated. And Germany will need to become the base of Europe, soon to be EU, for which they needed World War II to happen. So you've got that happening by 1881. Hyman is creating this structure and this plan on how to internationalize the colonies. By 1815, Britain defeats Napoleon, and the colonial empire is massive, pretty much global. And so they need a way to restructure and control this colonial empire. And socialism is a way to do it. So 1884, as I said, Fabianism is created, and Hyman is all about the economics of free trade, industrialization, etc., and the gradual equalization of these nations. So 1887, imperial conferences of the dominions of the colonies. America isn't a dominion, it's a republic, but it was a part of these imperial conferences, and also other mechanisms of presidents and prime ministers of the colonies coming together to initiate or adopt British policy. This was the first kind of conference before League of Nations, before UN, before WEF, before all these societies and these conferences that we have today, and Chatham House and their offshoots in every country, every colony, like CFR, AIIA in Australia. Before all of these kind of institutions and mechanisms of deploying British policy, they had the Imperial Conference, which started in 1887. And it was a way to bring all the colonies together, all of the representatives of the colonies together to deploy and adopt British policy, not just their parliaments and their governments. So that was, in a way, the kind of like what succeeded that was the Commonwealth, and then after, the UN and League of Nations. And League of Nations, you'd have to be a dominion to be a part of the League of Nations. So that's why you have a lot of these countries going through into these conferences, even nowadays, through the UN, and why you have Prince Harry and Meghan and all of these royal family members talking at the UN. Okay, so 1903, I think that's when Pilgrim Society is created to expand the American-British relations. And basically that's just really, Pilgrim Society were the ones involved who created Chatham House, who created the Fed, who set up the US to adopt the income tax and to adopt the democracy of what it is today and the free will of the people. Pilgrim Society was responsible for pretty much all of that. Pilgrim Society also involved Americans like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who funded, these two funded mostly everything in terms of the restructuring of systems theory of the Germans pre and post World War II to help with the restructuring, the internationalization of British governance. That was really what World War II was for. So what are we up to? 1903. We're up to Pilgrim Society. 1909 and 1916, you have internationalization of the British Empire and the governance, the international banknote, and America or Germany are that will lead the central governance of the world. 1900, I should say as well, was the creation of the Labour Party from the Fabian Society. This is all Labour Party, was again to create the people's government in UK because they didn't have it. They were really basing a lot off what they were putting through the US, and they were trying as a whole under all of their colonial governance, because I think the British Empire is also a part of the governance in a sense that they were trying to create this democracy across all colonies and the free will of the people, free trade, etc., globalization. So we have 1916 will be the last of the international government that the Fabian Society is promoting. 1913, birth certificates come into play, and so does the income tax in America. That's pretty big. So they've created all these mechanisms to ensure that you think you have free will, that there's a democracy, there is a growing, fermenting democracy, and income tax by 1913 is given. 1920, League of Nations is created, which is also just another means of a conference for all colonies and nations to come together in a different kind of way to deploy British global policy. It replaces the UN in 1945 after World War II. But also in 1920, Chatham House is created by Pilgrim Society in UK, and its offshoots like the CFR, Council of Foreign Relations in America, in the colonies are created. That's also a way to deploy British policy. Rather than always having to have these conferences, you have this kind of like central control within each nation. And then you have the global conferences or global get-togethers, shall we say. By 1931, Commonwealth succeeded imperial policy conferences by the Statute of Westminster. And then you have by World War II, it brought about the German base of Europe, or EU. EU was created. The international courts were created through the Treaty of Rome. The UN succeeded League of Nations, and America became the democratic powerhouse and savior of the world, economically, politically. And so you see this transition, this move. And so that was when imperialism was pretty much dropped in its entirety. It took World War I and World War II for the feudalistic, the feudal imperial empire to be completely restructured and transitioned into either a communist colony like Russia, or a democratic colony like America. But either way, it was socialism and the will of the people, and a proletariat. So they knew that overt feudal monopolization and liberty just could not blend together. And so they needed something that would work, a framework that would work. And America became the shining example of that. I should also mention, before I finish up, just with this real sketch of this kind of introduction of democracy and why it all has taken place, that Heinemann, the founder of socialism and this sort of governance of democracy, and also of communism, or he was a carrier of communism through Marx and is it Owens or Owen? The whole point of socialism is also to return to the golden age of the people in Britain. And the golden age of the golden age, let's just say, is what Trump is referring to in all of his new talks under his Heritage Foundation British administration. He wants return of the golden age, just as much as Heinemann did in 1881 and the British Empire does. And what that refers to is, I think it's Henry I? Anyway, the up until the late 14th century to the early 16th century in Britain, that is what is called the pinnacle of this golden age, where everything was in harmony, where that was really the establishment of the British peoples, of the finest of the British peoples. And things to note, especially, was that land was regarded as a means for food and stock facilitation, not as a capital investment. So they want to return to this British nirvana of economics and politics, where everything was running harmoniously. And that is what is being supported today. Before I drop off, because I was just about to drop off, there is one thing to add. The Constitution, the US Constitution, and mostly all colonial constitutions, there is a separation of legislative power, which belongs to Britain, and which is in, obviously, the US Congress and the House of Representatives, which is the offshoot of the British House of Commons, and the White House and the presidency. There's a difference between legislative power and executive power. The president represents the executive power. The Congress or House of Representatives represents the legislative power. The legislative power, the system itself, does not change. For example, no matter what type of governance you have a proletariat, you have tax. You have certain things in place that won't ever change, right? But executive admin is more about executive orders or that sort of policy change. But it administers the legislation. It has no say. The executive has no say and no power regarding legislation. That is the Congress. Congress is separate. No matter what you may believe, it is completely separate and it is completely different power. And that's why, anyway, it's a completely different power. And in the books that I've read many of these books to learn about this history. I think Carnegie talks about in the Triumphant Democracy book. Firstly, that when the Civil War erupted, which could have been, I'm presuming it was orchestrated to bring about certain changes. It was because as well the argument was very feeble and very weak, and I think it was to make, it was like Hegelian dialectics. I think it was to make Americans believe that they had no choice, but this was still a great choice, whatever was to come. The governance would always be a federal Commonwealth. America, the states, or America unified would always be a British Commonwealth, a British federal Commonwealth, right? And what you were arguing over was just simply the way that it was going to be governed, whether you were going to have several states or whether you were going to have a unified country. And I think what happened was I can't exactly remember, I'd have to go back to my notes, but basically the several states of the southern side, I think it's called southern, I can't remember, that basically had just such a weak argument, it negated itself. It was just completely weak. It was still going to be a federal government. And so they knew that they had to have British governance overall, legislative governance, and they still wanted the protections and the powers of Britain. Really, I just don't think they had a choice. They would always be a Republic of Britain. It was just, your choice as to how you were going to have it governed, hence the war. And, decisions were made. But it didn't change anything, really. What it did is it made people stop believing that choices were being made by the King of Britain. And instead, it was by the will of the people, or the will of a American government with an American president and an American form of governance. But again, that 1865 law was all about, you can create some laws or some policies, but it cannot it cannot contradict imperial legislation. So that was always going to be it. And presidents in Carnegie's book are described as mere agents. Simple as that. They are agents. They usually come from aristocracy. They usually come from money. They are not the proletariat. They will never be the proletariat. There's this kind of snobbery and arrogance that still the British aristocracy rises within America's presidency. And that sorry, there's just so much information. And that because as they are mere agents, they do not have a say in actual legislation. And I think this is a good starting point to introduce you to the role of Donald Trump, even Obama, Biden as a complete uniparty, because they are a mere agent allowing British policy and British legislation to take place for Agenda 2030. They have no power. That's why Trump has had in his 2017 presidency and now his 2025 presidency, his administration is Britain's Heritage Foundation. So that, and Congress are the ones really in power also, which is still British. So you have all of this happening where Trump is just the face of British Agenda 2030 to completely restructure their colonial governance of the world, to bring in socialism, to make sure we own nothing and we're happy, for the digital economy, AI to take over, potentially CBDCs, which is definitely more than likely, etc., etc. They are agents of the British Empire. They do not hold any power whatsoever. And that was always in these books in history, which are there, you can read up and find them, explain that these are just mere agents paid to ensure the governance of these colonies for the British Empire. Are deeply aligned with British governance or British legislation. So I think at this point I'll stop here. I'll give you links to my current research of what I've done or what I've read and observed and gathered. And from there, we'll move forward to Trump's presidency in 2017 and his push for Agenda 2030. Thank you.